Hello, everyone. Sarah Lords here with the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at Arizona State University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our public conversation with Dr. Lisa Sideris entitled Fragile Earth and the Sacred, From Rachel Carson to Earth 2.0. This talk emerges from the Beyond Secularization, Religion, Science, and Technology, and Public Life, an interdisciplinary initiative housed at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. To offer an overview of today's event, we will begin with opening comments by Dr. Tirosh-Samuelson, who is one of the principal investigators of the project, as well as the director of the Center for Jewish Studies, the Irving and Miriam Loeb Professor of Modern Judaism, and the Regents Professor of History at ASU. She'll share a bit more on the Beyond Secularization project, introduce Dr. Sideris, and will also lead a discussion following Dr. Sideris' talk. After this, we will move on to audience Q&A. Attendees are welcome to submit questions using the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar, not the chat function, if you kindly do so. Alternatively, if you are watching via YouTube Live or our social media channels, you are welcome to submit your questions by emailing sarah.lords@asu.edu, Sarah with an H, S-A-R-A-H, .lords, L-O-R-D-S @asu.edu. We are so glad that you can join us for this important event, and I will now turn things over to Dr. Tirosh-Samuelson to share more about the Beyond Secularization project and introduce Dr. Sideris.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Professor Tirosh-Samuelson, and I'm one of the principal investigators of this project, Beyond Secularization, Religion, Science, and Technology in Public Life. The other two principal investigators are Professor Ben Hurlbut from the School of Life Sciences and Professor Gaiman Bennett from the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. In addition to us, the three of us, principal investigators, our collaboratory consists of 3 postdoctoral fellows and 6 graduate students. We meet regularly. Now, of course, we meet by Zoom, and we host public events and webinars with colleagues in the United States, in Europe, and in Israel. This project seeks to understand the interplay between religion, technoscience, and secularism by examining 3 related areas. The first area we call the human, and we ask the question, or we ponder how we configure the meaning of being human, especially in light of biomedical research and of biotechnology. The second area we call the digital, and it focuses on how digital technology shapes our social and cultural lives. And the third area, to which we refer as the natural, inquires about how we, human beings, relate to the natural world. Since we engage these areas in tandem, our inquiry is distinctly interdisciplinary. It integrates history, science and technology studies, sociology, anthropology, and religious studies. Our inquiry is also critical. We interrogate assumptions that are taken for granted, and we shed light on practices that are, quote unquote, hidden in plain sight. That is, they shape our social, cultural, and political lives without us being aware of them. One such assumption is that science functions as a secularizing force. According to this assumption, as scientific knowledge and technological capacity increase, religion retreats into the background. This is the core of what is known as the Secularization Thesis, which has been the reigning paradigm of the social sciences in the 20th century. This idea that science has a secularizing effect, inevitably leading people to overcome religion or leave it behind, also functions as a regulatory ideal, informing and governing the ways we think about progress. In this way, it informs norms and agendas of knowledge making, education, and innovation. It shapes how we think about the social and moral authority of particular forms of knowledge, experience, and expertise, thus affecting the forms of discourse and reasoning that are privileged or conversely are marginalized in the public sphere. And it constrains how ideas of the public good tend to be articulated and deliberated. And yet, despite the prominence and prevalence of this theory, and despite many institutions acting as if it is true that science secularizes, and that this secularizing is somehow desirable, our analysis shows that the story is much more complicated. Not only has religion not disappeared from public life, if you listen to how people imagine the technological future, you find that their vision is saturated with reference to transcendence, redemption, or salvation. In other words, science or technoscience today, whether in Silicon Valley, in the biotechnology industry and biomedical research, or even in environmental movements, is invested with religious or spiritual meaning. Because human beings are meaning-seeking and myth-making animals. Therefore, the boundaries between religion, science, and technology are a lot more porous than we realize, which has profound implications for how we think about progress. Our initiative then seeks to reopen the questions of progress without taking for granted the assumptions that have hidden in plain sight and govern dominant ideas of progress. Instead, we explore the porous boundaries of religion and technoscience in particular sites of social significance and public influence, not only in the United States, but also in South Korea, Brazil, and Israel. We ask, how did this particular intertwining of religion, science, and technology come about? Why? To whom does it matter? What are the implications of such a fusion? How are ideas of progress being reified and reimagined here? This week, we are very honored to host our second visiting scholar, Professor Lisa H. Sideris. Lisa Sideris is a professor of religious studies at Indiana University and associate director of the Indiana University Center for Religion and the Human. Her expertise lies at the intersection of science, religion, and the natural world. In her first book, Environmental Ethics, Ecological Theology, and Natural Selection, which was published in 2003, Professor Sideris explored how religious environmentalists have engaged Darwin's theory of evolution, to what extent they interpreted Darwin correctly, and where they misread Darwin's evolutionary theory as they constructed their own eco-theology. In her second book, a co-edited volume under the title Rachel Carson, Legacy and Challenge, it was published in 2008, Professor Sideris focused on Rachel Carson, the person who has given rise to the environmental movement in the United States, making all of us aware of the damage we are inflicting on the natural world, intentionally or unintentionally. Carson's concept of wonder has remained the source of inspiration for Professor Sideris, who in her most recent book under the title Consecrating Science, Wonder, Knowledge, and the Natural World, which was published in 2017, she has critiqued science-based spiritual movements that make the human species the center of the cosmos, as well as the telos of the evolutionary process. And as a result, it has lost sight of the richness, distinctiveness, and irreducible otherness of the natural world. As you already know, the title of Professor Sideris' lecture is Fragile Earth and the Sacred, from Rachel Carson to Earth 2.0. And after the lecture, I will pose 2 or 3 questions to Professor Sideris, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. So on behalf of all of us, let me welcome Professor Sideris to ASU. I'm going to mute myself and turn off my video camera so we could all listen to Professor Lisa Sideris.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I assume you're hearing me okay. I'll pull up my slides in a minute and hopefully we'll all be seeing those as well. Should certainly get us off to a good start. So thank you for that introduction. There are so many elements of the project there on secularization, beyond secularization, that intersect with my own work. We've already had one workshop this week and found lots of areas of overlap, very fruitful areas of discussion. I'm looking forward to more of those this week. And thank you to Hava and to Jennifer Clifton and Sarah Lords and probably other people that I'm not aware of who have helped to bring these events together. So my lecture today is going to be focusing on, let me pull my slides up here and make sure that it's working. Okay, that looks all right. So my lecture today is focusing on different images of the earth and of nature from roughly, the 1960s sort of grassroots environmentalism and Rachel Carson up to the present sort of, techno age and space exploration. And I'm especially interested in many of those things that Hava mentioned a moment ago, the places where religion is sort of hiding in plain sight, or sort of expressions of a kind of implicit religiosity, sometimes explicit, but often implicit. And some of the sort of moral and spiritual implications, both for humans and for nature, of different, common images that have emerged and evolved of the earth and nature, over the last several decades. So as Hava mentioned, one of my reference points is Rachel Carson. So I'm going to begin with some thoughts about Silent Spring and the images of nature that appear in that book, and coming sort of up to the present, thinking about what's called sort of Anthropocene, or sort of a human-controlled nature, and humans continuing, at least prospective colonization of space and movement into space, and what it means to think of space as itself a kind of ecological concept. So in the early 1960s, Rachel Carson was trying to think of different titles for her book that would become Silent Spring. And one that she landed on for a period of time was Man Against the Earth, which of course is a very different sounding title than Silent Spring. Silent Spring had been the chapter of one of her books, the chapter of the book that was focused on birds in particular, and it became the title for the whole book. But in thinking about Man Against the Earth as a title, Carson was sort of thinking of Earth as this sort of entity against which humans, as some other sort of aggregate entity, had sort of arrayed itself in some sense. And in a way that really was, had connotations of warfare. So one of her closest friends, Dorothy Freeman, remarked that Silent Spring was a much better title, and that it had a particularly feminine sound to it. She praised what she calls the feminine quality of the sound of it compared with Man Against the Earth. One of the most enduring sort of motifs of Silent Spring, although if you actually have read the book, you won't find the image or even the idea mentioned all that often. And yet one of the most enduring images that many people have from Silent Spring is that of the sort of eggshells that were, weakened and fragile, because of DDT. And throughout the book, Carson often invokes a kind of image of nature that's a very fragile and delicate, balance, a very delicate fabric of nature on the one hand, but there's also an image of a kind of, so here you see some images of eggshells weakened by DDT and just kind of advertisements for DDT, sort of part of the American way of life, to keep it free, part of American enterprise. But throughout Silent Spring, there was kind of a juxtaposition on the one hand of nature as fragile and in need of our protection and care, but also a kind of nature that fights back. One of the chapters of Silent Spring is called Nature Fights Back. And it depicts a kind of nature that humans, provoke at their own peril, a very fearsome sort of entity. So the idea that nature fights back suggests that, our attempts to control nature, and especially with chemicals, will eventually backfire. So even though Carson over the decades has been, routinely at least attempted to be discredited by sort of, feminine visions of her as overwrought, as emotional, and having a kind of romantic view of nature, in fact, she often deployed a lot of military metaphors in talking about how humans should, kind of protect themselves against the natural world. Phrases like urging scientists to use a battery of armaments, direct means of destruction and new lines of attack. But she was focused instead of chemical sort of attacks on sort of biological methods of controlling nature. And so in one sense, Silent Spring wasn't really so much a call for humans to lay down arms, but rather to sort of devise more discriminant weapons against nature. And especially using the sort of Darwinian forces that nature itself, they're inherent in nature, and sort of using them to our advantage. But of course, there isn't any sort of necessary contradiction between thinking of Earth as fragile on the one hand, and thinking of it as something that might, fight back, or that we might, be wary of because we don't want to provoke it. So Carson herself often spoke sort of simultaneously of nature as both delicate and destructible, but also miraculously tough and resilient, capable of striking back in ways that we can't anticipate. And I want to kind of pick up on some of those two strands of nature or the Earth as being fragile, but also something that's kind of resilient that will outlast humans, right? But it's interesting to think that, the legacy of Carson's work is often something of species endangerment, concern about that, and a sense that humans need to steward or protect the environment. Because in much of her writing, she actually seems to suggest that, as they say, nature bats last. Nature has the last laugh. So in order to kind of understand the context of Carson's writing, there were sort of shifting notions during the 1950s and the 1960s until she died in 1964, of coming to understand that maybe the Earth, and particularly the oceans, were not quite as indestructible as she had thought. So, with all the sort of techno advances of the 1960s, there were other images of Earth that were emerging against these kinds of, on the one hand, fragile, and maybe on the other hand, a kind of bellicose nature. Carson died in 1964, and so she didn't live to see many of the, significant advances and breakthroughs in the space age. But her reaction to, in particular, the launch of Sputnik was very jarring. And it's sort of against this backdrop of beginning to think that perhaps the oceans, about which she had actually written her first 3 books. So before Silent Spring, Carson was already a well-known author for 3 different books that she had written on the ocean. And in terms of the evolution of Carson's thinking, so it's important to understand that her beliefs were sort of changing, that she was beginning to think that maybe, the oceans actually weren't so indestructible after all, even though they're vast and ancient, that, humans might actually be able to, if not destroy them, then at least change them in some very disturbing ways. And so in particular, in the 1960s, with the dumping of radioactive materials into the oceans, Carson began to sort of revise her worldview and thinking of the oceans as something that was sort of beyond the reach of human destruction. And so in 1961, she penned a new preface to The Sea Around Us, which had been published in the 50s, like in the mid-50s. They kind of took account of this new view of the potentially fragile oceans and humans' potential to destroy them. And so Carson notes that there was, quote, "There's long been a sort of certain comfort in the belief that the ocean was inviolate, beyond man's ability to change and to despoil. This belief," she continues, "is now known to be naive." And she concludes that it's a curious situation that the sea from which life arose should now be threatened by the activities of one form of that life. And yet still she maintained that the sea, though changed in sinister ways, will continue to exist. The threat is rather to life itself. So one might wonder what it means for the sea to continue without life. And that's a point that I'll come back to in a little bit. So here Carson is echoing some thoughts about the changing role of humans vis-a-vis nature that she sometimes expressed privately. Her biographer, Linda Lear, notes that the achievement of the Sputnik launch represented for Carson a kind of intrusion of mankind into dimensions of nature that many, including Carson, had previously regarded as sacrosanct. Lear goes on to note that Carson reacted to these developments less as a scientist impressed at the technical achievement than as a philosopher disturbed by its potential for evil and destruction. Privately, Carson wrote to Dorothy Freeman, one of her closest companions, a really remarkable letter that sort of shows how she registered the launch of Sputnik as a major jolt and a shock to some of her long-held beliefs. And I've got sort of that text, some of it in full here so you can read it. So Carson writes, very much like what she was saying about the ocean before, that it was comforting to believe that the ocean was indestructible. Here she says it was very pleasant to have these beliefs that much of nature was forever beyond the tampering reach of man, that he might level the forests and dam the streams, but the clouds and the rain and the wind were gods. So there's a very, what I call sort of a Jobian view of nature, sort of the book of Job, that certain aspects of nature really belong to God and not to humans. She goes on to say, it was comforting to suppose that however the physical environment might mold life, that life could never assume the power to change drastically or even destroy the physical world. She goes on to say, I still feel there is a case to be made for my old belief that as man approaches the new heaven and the new earth, or the space age universe, if you will, he must do so with humility rather than arrogance. And along with humility, she says, I think there's still a place for wonder. Of course, she says, in pre-Sputnik days, it was easy to dismiss so much as science fiction fantasy. But now the most far-fetched schemes seem entirely possible of achievement. And man seems actually likely to take into his hands, ill-prepared as he is psychologically, many of the functions of God. And so Carson puts God in quotes in this last bit, but she also invokes God in this first paragraph, not in quotes, which is kind of an interesting move. But I think what we see here in this letter is Carson's kind of dawning recognition that there's a new sort of human emerging, a human that we might call the sort of Anthropocene human, the anthropos human who is now capable of dramatically altering the earth in ways that we have to conceive a whole new scale of the magnitude of this change. So humans here are kind of increasing in their God-likeness, even though we poorly execute our God-likeness. So I think this signals for Carson not only a change in her own imaginary of what the human was becoming, but really a kind of cultural shift, at least in the West, of what our species was capable of, a kind of reappraisal of our power as a species. And so what does it mean to say that Carson had regarded certain dimensions of nature as sacrosanct, as her biographer says? One of the clues to this really lies in, especially in her sea writings, the sheer number of times that Carson uses the words mystery and mysterious, a kind of reverence and awe for the oceans and for their, for their ancient, they were there at the very beginning, a kind of reverence for them and a sense that humans are very small in comparison to the oceans. But then, humans are now coming on the scene in the 60s, creating toxins that can outlast us, what Timothy Morton might call hyperobjects today, things that persist well beyond humans. And so it seems that humans have now positioned themselves to take on the functions of God. There's a kind of reversal of the proper order of things, as Carson saw it. But of course, in the 1960s, there were all kinds of images of reverence for the earth, especially of Mother Earth. I think with the rise of grassroots environmentalism, you especially began to see these kinds of ideas of loving Mother Earth. And Earth is something that cares for us and that we have to care for in turn and have affection for. And of course, the idea of the Earth as being a mother is a much, much older thing than this. It goes back to ancient times, thinking of Earth as a mother. But with the environmental movement, this really sort of gained, a new life again. These images of the Earth, some of which, came from, the space exploration that was going on at the time, thinking about Mother Earth as this whole entity, like an organism, as in this image, the kind of famous blue marble image that you see here. So one of the first images of the Earth from space was captured in lunar orbit, the Earthrise image that I'm sure many of us have seen. So this image was taken during Apollo 8, 1968. So not actually landing on the moon, but the lunar orbit. So Christmas Eve, which is kind of an interesting thing, and I'll say more about that in a moment. So along with the sort of iconic blue marble image that I think we've all seen at this point, the sort of Earthrise image also became kind of an icon of the beginning of the environmental movement. Okay. So these images appeared on flyers, advertisements for the first Earth Day. And, to this day, they appear on textbooks of environmental ethics. I have a textbook that I often use in my classes that features the whole Earth on the cover. Stuart Brand, who the story here is that he dropped acid one day and was looking at the San Francisco skyline and noticed the sort of curvature of the Earth, and he started imagining sort of floating out into space and thinking, how amazing it would be to see the Earth from space. And so he began to petition NASA with these buttons. Why haven't we seen a photograph of the whole Earth yet? NASA finally released that photo, and ultimately Stuart Brand put it on the cover of his whole Earth catalog, which is a kind of do-it-yourself manual for, of the counterculture, people sort of wanting to get back to nature by using technology. So all of this is going on. And then you've got statements from some of the early astronauts talking about, the way that they discovered the Earth when they went to space. And one of the most famous of these, although it's often attributed to Neil deGrasse Tyson, but actually comes from astronaut Bill Anders, is this idea that, quote, we went all that way to discover the moon, and what we really discovered was the Earth. And in a similar vein, the Earthrise image has often been seen by some wilderness photographers as, quote, the most influential environmental photograph ever taken. And yet there's something very peculiar about claiming these images as nature photography or wilderness photography. Certainly it's a far cry from the sort of wilderness photography that we normally think of. It's not even taken on Earth, for one thing. It's removed from Earth in a very dramatic way. And it's also quite different from the images with which Rachel Carson began Silent Spring. So if you know the book, she begins with this little fable about a small town in America that's sort of like, every town in America that's been sort of overexposed to chemicals, and people are watching things die around them. And so it's a very haunting tale, but it's very much about the local, the local environment, not the sort of abstract Earth seen from space. So what I want to suggest then is that there's a kind of scaling up of the idea of Earth and of nature, but also a kind of dramatic shift in the human, himself or ourselves, right? In the sense that there's a new kind of creature that's emerging, alongside the sort of scaling up of the Earth as this sort of abstract entity. And yet there are ways in which this entity is not abstract at all. For some people, at least, it was experienced as a very intimate kind of connection, not something that's sort of removed and detached. So Frank White, who's someone who calls himself a space philosopher, has written a book about what he calls the overview effect. There's a film that's also called Overview, and you can look it up. It's a short film, about 20 minutes long. And Frank has sort of spent years documenting the spiritual responses of astronauts, spatial astronauts, Apollo astronauts, who have actually had this view of the Earth from space. And he calls this the overview effect. It's the sort of big picture, almost like a God's eye view of the planet. And for many people who've experienced this view of Earth from space, and obviously it's, a fairly small number of people, although you can kind of get the feeling if you're on an airplane, looking down on the Earth, many of them expressed a very profound sense of unity, of solidarity, of interconnectedness, a sense that everything is one. So many of them expressed a kind of a cognitive shift, but also a kind of spiritual shift and a kind of awe-filled appreciation and sort of, renewed profound appreciation for the Earth's fragility. So related to this, astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I mentioned a moment ago. So, Tyson, of course, followed in the footsteps of Carl Sagan as the host of the Cosmos series. Tyson often invokes this sort of trope that you probably heard before that, from space, Earth exhibits no boundaries, it sort of erases all those boundaries. And so he suggests that, seen from a great distance, all is one. The Earth is all one. We're one species, it's one planet. And he goes on to suggest that without this image of the Earth from space, not only would we not have the first Earth Day, but we wouldn't have things like Doctors Without Borders. We couldn't have even imagined a world that didn't have borders without this view of Earth from space. Now, a particularly kind of poignant case of this, of an astronaut who had a real kind of conversion experience, a kind of mystical experience that was really changed his life after seeing this view of the Earth from space, is astronaut Edgar Mitchell. So looking out into space, he says he had this moment of a kind of ecstatic experience. And he went on, after he retired, to pursue research in human consciousness, the paranormal, UFOs, parapsychology, mysticism. And he even founded a sort of company in California that was aimed at creating what he called ecologically pure products and services designed to alleviate planetary problems. And so there's a kind of shift from that view of the Earth from space to a very particular sort of ecological agenda, trying to save the planet in some sense. So during spaceflight, this was Apollo 14, I believe in 1971, Mitchell experienced a kind of sudden recognition that the molecules in his body, were the same as those in the stars. Humans, he realized, are stardust, echoing the sort of countercultural theme of Woodstock, right? We are stardust. We've got to get ourselves back to the garden and all of that. We're a billion-year-old carbon. So that's maybe a bit of a more extreme case, but other astronauts also described the sort of shock of witnessing just how paper thin that atmosphere is. When you look at the Earth, when you're looking up at the sky, it seems like, from Earth that we could just keep putting all of these pollutants in it and nothing would ever happen. But when you see it from space, it's just this tiny little, terrifyingly thin, fragile layer around the planet, which is basically the only thing that's, keeping everything alive, that's preventing us from, the sort of the abyss of space that lies beyond. And yet there's something very paradoxical in this perception of Earth as a planet and sort of seeing Earth as a planet for the first time, because that makes Earth into a kind of object in space. And also our sun becomes a kind of star, right? So not just our familiar sun, but one of many, many stars in the universe, in a very vast and cold, and in some ways a kind of impersonal universe. So in other words, to see the Earth as a planet involves a shift in perspective that's actually far more ambiguous than these expressions of unity, interconnection, and concern for Earth's fragility might suggest. This ambiguity is captured in commentary that's offered in the film overview that Frank White recorded. There's one particular philosopher who talks about sort of the next stage of human evolution after seeing the Earth from space is for humans to move out into space travel. So, this marks a kind of step forward in civilization, or our species as a whole, and in particular, a step towards grasping Earth as a spaceship. So there's that metaphor of spaceship Earth. And so just keep that spaceship metaphor in mind. And I'm going to come back to it in a moment. So from Mother Earth to spaceship Earth. So astronaut Bill Andrews' commentary that orbiting the moon actually led us to discover the Earth is really only half of the story. Connections between the timing of the lunar orbit on Christmas Eve and the spiritual nature of the Apollo mission, and especially the Earthrise image itself, are not lost on boosters of space travel. So there's a poem, and you can also look this up on YouTube. There's a little video of it that's sort of riffing on, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, the visit from St. Nicholas, called 'Twas the Apollo Before Christmas. And it begins like this. 'Twas T-9, 'twas T-10 with the world looking on. And it goes on to reference the Apollo spaceship as a chariot of fire. And then note these lines: to the farthest of reaches, to the heavens beyond, now fly away, slip free the earth's surly bonds. So I had never heard this expression, surly bonds, when I ran across this, and I had to look it up, try to figure out what it means. And it turns out, at least one of the places that it comes from is a poem that was written called High Flight by a fighter pilot named John Gillespie McGee. In that poem, McGee says, "Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth." And the poem ends like this: with silent lifting mind, I've trod the high untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God. And so at the same time that the whole earth image inspired stewardship and care for our home, it also quickened a kind of desire to leave earth behind, to escape its surly bonds. And also in doing so, to escape the constraints of ourselves, of what it means to be human, to use the language that Hava was using to introduce the project, to transcend what it means to be human, to orient ourselves towards some sort of transcendent goal. So an impulse to colonize other planets and then, in some sense, solidify our status as a cosmic species. So while it's a sort of symbol of interconnectedness and solidarity, the Earth image from space is also, some would say, a banner of sort of alienation, an escape from Earth. On this account, the image and the sort of technology that goes along with it are symbols of human transcendence and liberation. So the overview perspective marks a kind of technological transcendence for the human. And really our capacity to take up a kind of omnipresence in the universe and sort of in being nowhere in particular, everywhere, then we've sort of lost our place in terms of our relationship to the earth. We have become, in some sense, truly cosmopolitan, a term that means to be a citizen of the cosmos. So with this understanding of Earth as a planet, then comes the realization that we, even while we're living on Earth, are already in space. And if we live in the universe and Earth is a planet, a category that includes many other bodies in the universe, then it seems natural that Earth might come to be seen as merely our home base, or what astrobiologists call our host planet. So just think about Earth as a host, as something that's hosting us. So this suggests that we might live on other planets as well, right? And so in this sense, getting a sort of better view of the Earth from space also brings with it a kind of what one scholar calls a psychic aloofness from the planet. To understand Earth as hosting us suggests that other planets might serve that function as well. And this sort of fundamentally changes our relationship to Earth, right? That we're no longer merely Earthlings, but maybe something like worldlings, creatures who belong to the cosmos at large. So now perhaps Earth seems less our natural home and more like what astrobiologists call an exoplanet, that is sort of a planet out there in space, a world as seen from the outside, objectively. It might even begin to seem like something an engineer can manipulate or break or fix at will, say a spaceship Earth. So back to that sort of metaphor of the spaceship Earth. So for some proponents of space exploration, such as the philosophers who are quoted in the film Overview, humanity's evolution as a cosmic species and our development of technologies that allow us to view the Earth from this objective stance are seen as sort of synonymous with our collective maturity as a species, right? So that Earth comes to represent our juvenile home, you know. And so in this sense, in evolving as space creatures, we no longer need that Mother Earth. So let me just go back to this slide for a moment. So sort of moving from Mother Earth to spaceship Earth to an exoplanet is a process of maturity. And ultimately we have to leave our mother. We have to grow up and become not cosmic teenagers, but some sort of cosmic grown-ups. And in this sense, once Earth begins to be seen as potentially interchangeable with other planets in the universe, those exoplanets towards which astrobiologists are sort of making overtures as potential planets that we might one day inhabit, then the Earth begins to shed its singularity. There's nothing, you know, particularly special about it. And so in terms of the sort of ecological or environmental and moral implications of this, there's sort of two different conflicting imperatives that we now face. One of them is to care for the Earth, as the Mother Earth image suggests, but the other is to sort of escape its embrace in a kind of techno-spiritual quest to locate other worlds on which to perpetuate our species. So an ecological imperative to save the Earth becomes a survival imperative to save ourselves. So in terms of how this cosmic view of the planet has fueled environmental sensibilities and sort of spiritual aspirations, it seems like the results are rather mixed. Another common trope that emerges from the view of the Earth as a planet in space comes from, again, Neil deGrasse Tyson. And the way that he speaks of the Earth as, you know, something like a space rock that's a sort of timeless, deathless entity. So he says that Earth is really understood, you know, by scientists and should be understood by all of us as a 4.5 billion-year-old space rock. Earth now is a timeless space rock that's withstood, you know, catastrophes throughout its entire long history, long before humans ever came on the scene. And so our current, you know, assaults, or however you want to put it, on the environment, particularly climate change, in this context are just sort of a geological blip. It's just a minor moment in Earth's history, just a little oscillation. So on this account, it's really ourselves that we must save. The Earth will somehow cycle on. And so Tyson, you know, expressed this opinion in a widely circulated tweet on Earth Day, in which he says the following: environmentalists' sort of perennial call to save the Earth, he says, is odd. Planet Earth, he insists, survives massive asteroid strikes. It'll survive anything we throw at it, but life on Earth will not. So to whom or what does life refer in this context? And more to the point, what could it mean for Earth to continue without life? What sort of Earth would that be? And why would anyone want to be on it? So it seems to be kind of a dead planet. So often it's planet Earth in particular that is predictably spoken of in these terms as sort of virtually timeless, deathless, resilient entity with a long history of upheavals that precede humans' arrival on the scene. Planet Earth is Earth as seen from the outside, a sort of exoplanet among many others. And it's this Earth that we, I think, mistakenly believe that we can somehow escape if it becomes inhospitable to us, as, you know, people like Elon Musk are urging us to do. Or perhaps we'll simply reboot Earth with emerging technologies like geoengineering. Interestingly, elite members of human civilization stand to benefit the most from this detached off-planet perspective, which often seems to renounce any notion of a world that's actually shared by everyone in favor of a headlong flight from climate catastrophe. And this is something that Bruno Latour has written about in his book, Down to Earth, I think it's called. In another sort of remarkable book called The Unconstructible Earth, Frederick Nera, who teaches at University of Wisconsin in Madison, offers a sort of general similar diagnosis. Let me just go back to this slide for a minute. So he uses this term geoconstructivism. The term is not so important as just this idea of an Earth that can sort of be rebuilt, that's reconstructible, and he wants to resist that idea. So geoconstructivism, as he describes it, is a kind of detached view from the planet, a belief that we can somehow reprogram or reformat the Earth to rebuild it or find some other Earth-like planet that we can simply go to. So looking at the Earth as if from a position in space is a sort of off-planet perspective without any kind of vital relation to the ecosphere, he says. So Earth is a kind of Lego creation. And this is actually an image here of something that NASA put out on Earth Day, a sort of build a planet challenge, which is perhaps not the best image for thinking about Earth on Earth Day as something that we can rebuild or that is constructed or constructible. So along with this sort of build an Earth perspective is a worldview that Nera calls a-naturalism, sort of like, so atheism means sort of just not naturalism, right? So a-naturalism is a complete denial of the category of nature itself. Nature just becomes something that's meant to be remade, it's inanimate. The planet stands by ready to be reconstructed as Earth 2.0. Death itself, Nera writes, no longer has a place in the scientific discourse. The Earth might as well be Mars, or Mars a kind of perfectly suitable substitute for Earth, as if Earth were somehow lacking life or already dead. And so the survival of humanity, or again, some elite cosmopolitan subset thereof, becomes the overriding imperative of this sort of post-environmental planetary perspective. So an ecological imperative, again, to care for the Earth has been sort of replaced or eclipsed by a survival imperative that humans must stay alive, even if it means leaving the planet behind. So to conclude then, I think that perhaps some of Rachel Carson's worries have been borne out. The idea that humans' entrance into space, occupying realms that were once thought sacrosanct, brings with it a kind of godlike aspiration, or perhaps an evil intent. And with it, a loss of creaturely wonder and humility. Or put differently, humans and our technological feats seem positioned to eclipse wonder that was once directed toward nature and the Earth, now directed towards ourselves. So to use Carson's terms, man seems positioned once more against the Earth as an object of detachment and manipulation. So humans, or at least some humans, increasingly imagine that we'll simply re-engineer our space rock and its man-made warming climate. That's plan A, I guess, or maybe plan B. But failing that, today's visionaries claim we can simply leave it behind in pursuit of other exoplanets that might host us. So writing for The Guardian, the British journalist George Monbiot argues that these kind of space colonizing fantasies typically have one thing in common, a lack of imagination. He writes, quote, the same people who would consider the idea of living in the Gobi Desert completely intolerable rhapsodize about living on Mars. People who imagine that human life on Earth will end because of power and greed and oppression imagine that we will be able to escape these forces in pressure vessels controlled by technicians, as if somehow these very same technicians aren't the architects of oppression and greed, but some other breed of humans is going to appear to save us from this planet. And he goes on to say, only by understanding this as a religious impulse can we avoid the conclusion that those who gleefully await this future in space are insane. Earth from space, once seen as a symbol of unity and solidarity, of species oneness, increasingly seems then to represent the dreams of a subset of elite humans, a dream of throwing off Earth's surly bonds, to escape to a starlit heaven. Earth 2.0 then becomes the province of a godlike 1%, those who trespass to the sanctity of space. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. This was marvelous. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to ask only one question, and then we'll turn to the audience and get some questions from the audience. And my question to you would be this: as a person who perpetuates the legacy of Rachel Carson, what would be your message to the scientists? Especially here at ASU, we're at the forefront, as a matter of fact, of space exploration. So what would you tell them? How can the virtue of humility and the values that are attendant to it, how can they shape scientific education or the education of the scientist?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I mean, I think that, there's nothing inherently wrong with viewing space travel and phenomena of space as being wondrous and, awe-inspiring. They certainly are. And they do bring solidarity and kind of bring us together, which is something that right now our country certainly is lacking. But at the same time, I think there's a way of presenting science that is not, so that it's not seen as sort of inherently progressive in everything that we do, that any sort of advancement in science isn't necessarily a moral advancement or an advancement for the species as a whole, that it doesn't benefit everyone as a whole. And so, one way of, I think, of teaching science is to always make students aware of how much is not known. And there are scientists who do this. I'm thinking of Stuart Firestein, I think is his name, who teaches at Columbia. He does this thing where he sort of the class. So instead of teaching students about everything that we do know, he teaches students about all the things that we don't know. So it sort of foregrounds what we might call mysteries of science. And he says students are actually much more interested in learning that way. That it's exciting not only to think of mysteries that might be solved, because that's still just a kind of, it could be a kind of idle curiosity, but just to think about the fact that what we do know is just sort of, the tip of the iceberg of so many things that are unknown. And to sort of retain that sense of mystery, which I think is partly what Carson is arguing, can in itself kind of instill humility in the sense that ignorance is a virtue. There's a certain virtuous nature to ignorance.
Yeah, thank you. And Sarah, you're going to now show us some questions from the audience, right?
Hi, yes, I am. So again, for those of you who are watching via the webinar, please submit your questions through the Q&A function. We only have time for a few, so I'll just move right on to it. So the first question comes from Adam. Does the idea of Earth as a host somehow expose us to see ourselves as parasitic? Just as well, could the idea of ourselves as cosmic entities have something to do with our tendency to identify ourselves in relation to our minds rather than our bodies, being that our minds expand our view here through imagination beyond Earth while our bodies are rooted here?
Yeah, I mean, the host language is really interesting because on the one hand, it has that connotation of a parasite being the parasite and the host. But, the word host also is related to hospitality and terms like that. So I think it doesn't have to have that sense that to be hosting something is always to be being taken for granted or take advantage of. I think maybe a better image is to think of a kind of symbiosis, if we want to use kind of biological language of hosts and parasites and things like that, that we accommodate ourselves to the planet or to nature in some ways, and that there's a kind of mutual benefiting that can go on there, rather than, and what was the other bit about the cosmos? I didn't quite get that last part.
Yeah, so just as well, could the idea of seeing ourselves as cosmic entities have something to do with our tendency to identify ourselves in relation to our minds rather than our bodies?
Yeah, definitely. Because I think a lot of what's going on here is, when we talk about sort of leaving behind the surly bonds of the earth, it's also leaving behind human physical constraints, the constraints of the body, our own sort of limited and flawed nature to make ourselves into entities that can sort of, float freely in space in some senses, just like pure mind, which of course has a lot of religious, probably roots of this way of thinking. I mean, literally sort of ascending to heaven in some sense, where space has always represented human sort of aspirations to leave the body behind and its failings and its, really, and even our mortality itself.
Brilliant, thank you. Next question comes from Tom. Do you see any indication that the social sciences are shedding light on our current relationship to the natural world, alienation, exploitation, etc.? It would seem that we are in the grip of forces that we don't fully understand, given that we are wounding that which sustains us.
Yeah, I'm sure that I think all the disciplines are shedding light on that. So, I mean, that's part of what we need is to have more of an interdisciplinary conversation about that. So, I mean, I'm not a social scientist, so I don't know if there's sort of particular contributions that the questioner has in mind, or maybe you can help me with that question. Does it say anything more particular than that?
It doesn't. Maybe perhaps, do you think that there's anything unique that the social sciences are offering to sort of understanding our place in the world, especially as we are learning more about the effects of environmental degradation and that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, I certainly think that social sciences have been able to make a lot of connections between the ways that, and not just social scientists, but the ways that are the harms that we do to nature and to the planet are always, fundamentally human harms as well, right? That all of those things are very connected in terms of thinking about just social arrangements and the disproportionate harms of climate change on certain people. Absolutely.
All right, and final question. Thank you all for submitting. I'm sorry that we weren't get to all of them. This actually comes from Gaiman, one of our faculty affiliates. So can you say something about the Earth as a host, i.e. we don't really belong per se, and the longer history of what Max Weber calls the inner loneliness of the Protestant soul who has no place in the world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I do think this idea of being a host speaks to a certain kind of alienation that humans have always felt. We actually talked about this a little bit in the workshop that we had yesterday, is whether there's any way of humans ever talking about themselves in sort of the big stories that we tell, where we don't sense ourselves to be sort of exiles in some sense or alienated in some sense. And, the exploration of space and seeing the Earth from space has been this paradoxical thing in that sense, because it has both that sense of like a kind of deep entanglement, everything being connected, but at the same time, remarkably detached from something that we can now stand back and look at, and that science has delivered this thing that we can now stand back. So, I mean, that story's not over. I think that's something that we're still working through as human beings, try to figure out what it means to be in relation to not just the Earth from space, but what we might call sort of Earth system science, sort of understanding that environmental problems exist on this global scale, which requires a new way of thinking about who we are, and not necessarily that we're in control of it, but actually demonstrates that we're not in control of it at all. We've mistakenly imagined ourselves to be in control of it.
That's exactly right. Well, with this sober thought, we are going to thank Professor Sideris for this beautiful, very enlightening and really inspiring lecture. And Sarah Lords will tell us a little bit about activities of the center that are coming up.
Yeah, thank you both so much for facilitating that great dialogue. For those of you who are watching, if you are interested in exploring other such similar ideas, we do have another event coming up with the Beyond Secularization project featuring Whitney Bauman. Alternatively, if you're interested in a broader sense of the center's activities, please visit our website at csrc.asu.edu/events. If you're interested in sponsoring the work that we're doing here through our public lectures, also consider making a donation and becoming a friend of the center. And information for that is available at csrc.asu.edu/support. This talk will be available on all of our social media channels, primarily our YouTube page, and we thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Paula.
And thanks for the wonderful audience.
Yes, thank you. Whoever you are, I can't see you, but.
All right, thank you all. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.